So today we are reading from Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, Madhya Lila chapter 8, called Talks Between the Lord and Ramananda Rai. I will read text 176 on my own, and then we can all repeat for 177. The tilaka of good fortune is on her beautiful broad forehead. Her various loving affairs are a gem, and her heart is the locket. Now text 177 on the board. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srimati Radharani's gopi friends are her mental activities, which are concentrated on the pastimes of Sri Krishna. She keeps her hand on the shoulder of a friend who represents youth. Purport. Radharani's 8 companions, Ashtasakhi, are different varieties of pleasure connected with the pastimes of Krishna. Following those pastimes of Sri Krishna are other activities, which are represented by the assistance of the gopis. Om Jnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shlakaya Chakshurun Militam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. So this is an extended metaphor describing the qualities of Srimati Radharani as spoken by Ramananda Rai to Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And these are found also in a work called Premam Bhoja Maranda in Sanskrit by Srila Raghunath Das Goswami. And they are described here in Bengali language by Srila Krishnadas Kaviraj. So you've been hearing this for the past few weekends, I'm guessing, of how Srimati Radharani has different aspects of her activities and her personality all express or embody, represent her love for Krishna, and how her midday bath, her beautiful form, her jewelry, all these things represent different aspects of love for Krishna. I remember when the first time I read this particular passage, it was at a time when I was living in Oxford, when I was studying here in England. And in our morning programs there, we would read Chaitanya Charitamrita, much as you do here. And we came across this particular section. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really, really beyond me. Thinking of Srimati Radharani's form and how it represents different aspects of her love for Krishna, and those different mellows described corresponding with her forms, not only could I not imagine her form, but I couldn't imagine the things they were being compared to, which is the different aspects of rasa. And one really needs someone who's skilled in rasa shastra in order to explain those various facets and features that are being compared in a detailed way. Now, some 23 years later, after that first time I read it, I'm just as confounded by this description and feel just as much like someone like a dwarf reaching for the moon, trying to understand what is it exactly about Srimati Radharani's form and her beauty and her love, where everything can be mapped so nicely onto her love for Krishna. The basic point here is quite clear, being emphasized over and over again by Krishnadas Kaviraj, by Ramananda Rai, that Srimati Radharani's every aspect of her existence is a representation of her love for Krishna. She is, as Prabhupada explains in a purport just before this, she is the Lord's Hladini Shakti, the Lord's pleasure potency, and the original form of bhakti itself. And so there's nothing about Srimati Radharani's existence, her form, her beauty, her manner of behavior, her dress, her fragrance, everything exists only for Krishna's service and is the very embodiment of pure prema for Krishna. And through this metaphor, Ramananda Rai is giving us a glimpse into just how saturated every aspect of Srimati Radharani's existence is with love for Krishna. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the power and the importance of metaphor within our tradition. This is one example of an extended metaphor that we find, where one thing is mapped onto another thing to describe its particular qualities. But this is one of the great, great wonderful qualities of our scriptures and of the Vaishnav tradition, is the profusion and quality of metaphors. By the word metaphor, I mean here, I'm speaking generally to include analogies and similes. There's technical differences between each one of these, but they're not important for our purposes here. Basically, the comparison of one thing with another for a particular purpose. This is an analogy or a metaphor. And we find limitless numbers of metaphors in our scriptures. I mean, if I asked you just off the top of your head to think about the different examples, different analogies, different metaphors that we find in our scriptures, you could easily think of a dozen, right? I mean, just think of Krishna. His complexion is compared to the fresh monsoon rain cloud. In that monsoon night sky, his dhoti is like a bolt of lightning. And his earrings and his eyes shimmer like stars in that night sky. His nails, his toenails particularly, are like a series of moons. His nose is like a sesame flower. His eyes, famously, are like the petals of a lotus. There's that famous metaphor that Queen Kunti gives in first canto, where she provides us a vision of lotuses. Right? She says, Namah pankaja nabhaya, Namah pankaja maline, Namah pankaja netraya, Namaste pankajanghreye. I offer my obeisances to Krishna, whose eyes are like the petals of a lotus, whose navel is deep like a lotus, or from whose navel emerges a lotus, whose feet are like a lotus. Everything about Krishna is like a lotus flower. On and on and on. If you think of Bhagavad Gita and the philosophical metaphors found there, Krishna compares the mind of a yogi to a lamp that does not waver in a windless place. He describes knowledge as a jnana dipa, as a lamp within the heart of the devotee whom he favors. Jnana dipena bhasvata. He describes the yogi as like a tortoise who withdraws his limbs within the shell. And over again throughout the Gita, that beautiful metaphor of Krishna saying that everything rests upon him. Mai sarvam idam protam sutre manigana eva. Like pearls rest upon a thread. So everywhere you look, I mean all throughout Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, you find metaphors over and over and over again. And yet, at the same time, Srila Prabhupada warns us also about metaphorical interpretations of Scripture that remove the literal meaning of the text and reduce it to a mere metaphor. So, in other words, metaphors are a double-edged sword that are both beautiful and powerful and dangerous at the same time. Like so many things that are beautiful and powerful and dangerous at the same time. So let's think for a moment about what metaphors do for us, what this metaphor does for us. And we can find right away several things, several functions that metaphors serve in the scriptures. One function is literary in nature. Metaphors are literary embellishments. They're a form of alankara in Sanskrit. which is called upama, means the comparison of one thing with another. That serves to evoke some special quality or emotion in all its power in the listener, right? So poets will use a metaphor to evoke something that is easier evoked by a metaphor than it is said in a blunt way, like in a raw way, right? So when we say Krishna's eyes are like the petals of a lotus, or we say he is a lion among men, that conveys something that is simultaneously more powerful and beautiful and easier to convey than trying to explain that he's got large muscles and he can, when he comes into a room, people respect him and his voice is very powerful. Instead of describing all of that in detail, which you could, but that becomes tedious. Instead, the poet says he is a lion among men, or a bull among men, Purusharushabha, right? Krishna calls Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita, you're a bull among men. So, similarly with Krishna's eyes, to say they're shaped in a particular way, where they're narrow at the beginning, and then they grow larger, and then they're pointy at the end, would be not very tasteful, right? Instead, you say it's like the petals of a blooming lotus. And all of a sudden, immediately you know what Krishna's eyes are like, at least some aspects of them. Right? So, metaphors have a lot of literary power that conveys a point very easily and very clearly. Another very famous one is in 11th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, when Sanjaya is trying to explain to the blind king what he is seeing with the universal form. And he says, if 10,000 suns were to rise in the sky at the same time, that would be the brilliance and power of this universal form. And that was the metaphor of choice for Robert Oppenheimer, the scientist who invented the atomic bomb. When they first did the Trinity test, the original test of the atomic bomb in New Mexico in the United States, that's the metaphor that came to mind for him. 10,000 suns, right? When he saw the awesome power of an atomic bomb. And he was actually a great lover of the Bhagavad Gita and kept a copy on his desk, a pink-bound copy of the Bhagavad Gita on his desk. And his official biography is called 10,000 Suns, from this reference to the Bhagavad Gita. Here in these particular verses, as a result of these metaphors, we can appreciate something about the qualities of Srimati Radharani, right? That if someone is so saturated with love for Krishna, that every aspect of their being, their heart and their clothing and their ornamentation and their fragrance, everything can be compared to love for Krishna and the wonderful qualities that she embodies, which excite Krishna's love for her. So metaphors have a very powerful literary quality to them. But at the same time, metaphors are also very useful for didactic purposes, for teaching purposes. Metaphors take that which is unfamiliar and they make it familiar to the reader. So Krishna's universal form is unfamiliar to the average reader, right? We've not seen that universal form. It was certainly unfamiliar to Dhritarashtra. But by comparing it to suns, one sun, we can appreciate the power of one sun, and then multiplying it by 10,000 gives us the ability to grasp that which is ungraspable, to wrap our minds around something which our minds cannot reach, for language to achieve something from which all words ultimately turn away. Right? So by using these metaphors, we have a slight appreciation for a form of beauty that we cannot appreciate otherwise, right? Krishna's beauty is beyond compare. It's beyond words. And so metaphors are used in very clever ways. Krishna's face is like a full moon, except that doesn't quite do justice. So it's a full moon without all those spots and marks, right? Or Mahaprabhu's beauty is he's so beautiful that even the full moon becomes ashamed, and therefore is eclipsed on the night of his appearance. Or Nityananda Prabhu's presence is so cooling to those, so relieving to all of us who are suffering in the fire of this material existence, that his presence is like the cooling rays of the moon, not one but 10 million moons, right? Nitai Pada Kamala, Koti Chandra Shushitala, right? It's cooling like 10 million moons. So we can take our experience of one moon on a summer evening and the way it cools us, and we can multiply it, try at least, and recognize, oh, this is something beyond the power of estimation of my mind. And Srila Prabhupada used examples and analogies and metaphors so effectively throughout his preaching to teach difficult philosophical points in a way that even a newcomer would be able to understand. And so we find all these brilliant analogies. One of his most famous, of course, is that of the car and the driver that Prabhupada uses to explain the difference between the physical body and the spirit soul within. That this material body is inert, just like a car is inert without the presence of the driver. When the driver turns on the ignition and instills that vehicle with his energy, then the vehicle appears to be alive. Just like this material body appears to be alive when the presence of the spirit soul, the driver, is there. There's the example of the body like a chariot in Bhagavad Gita. The senses are like 5 horses, and the mind is like the reins, the intelligence is the driver, and the spirit soul is the passenger. This analogy is given in Bhagavad Gita by Srila Prabhupada in the purport. It's originally found in the Kathopanishad, where it serves to illustrate the relationship between the physical body, the subtle body, and the spirit soul. And whenever I'm teaching in the university about the way that the spirit soul and these different bodies are connected to each other in the philosophy of the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, then this metaphor always does the trick. Right? You can talk about subtle bodies and physical bodies and the soul, and it all becomes very confusing. But then you draw it out on a whiteboard and you make the picture of the chariot and the horses, and you ask people to map it onto there, and then you talk about the function of each item in the metaphor, and all of a sudden it's crystal clear. Right? It's very, very clear to any listener. So metaphors have a powerful teaching purpose connected to them, right? That you can convey very difficult and unfamiliar points in very easy to understand ways. And again, I'm sure you can think of other examples in the way that Srila Prabhupada uses them so effectively in his teaching. But then the final aspect of metaphors that I want to mention has to do with their role in philosophical argumentation. Metaphors play a very important role in building an argument. In Nyaya, in the formal logic, the school of philosophy in India called logic, Nyaya, there's a formal structure to an argument. It always begins by a particular statement, and then a specific statement and a general statement, and then it's followed by an example. So the famous example of this is, there is smoke on that mountain. Wherever there is smoke, there is fire. Therefore, there is fire on the mountain. Right? So simple syllogism, where one statement follows from another. You give a general principle: wherever there is smoke, there is fire. There is smoke there, therefore there must be fire. Right? So, but that syllogism is not complete unless there's a fourth element, which is an udaharana, an analogy to exemplify the point. And the analogy in this case is like in a hearth, in a fireplace. In a fireplace, there is smoke, and that means there is fire. Right? So you give an example to help the person recognize how the logic flows. In his Sandarbha, Srila Jiva Goswami gives a wonderful argument for the existence of the spirit soul, using this form of logic, this type of syllogism. And then from the existence of the spirit soul, he gives an argument for the existence of the super soul. And then from the existence of the super soul, he gives an argument for the existence of Bhagavan, the Supreme Person. It's a brilliant logical sequence, and we don't have time to go into all the steps, but just the first one he gives is that of, he says, this world is inert, matter is inert, it's dead, but we find it to be moving, to be active. That which is dead cannot be active on its own. Therefore, there must be some other active principle present within it, which is the Atma. And then he gives the example, he gives the analogy to go with it. He says, like a woodcutter and an axe. So, what is it that cuts wood in a forest? It's an axe. But an axe, everyone knows, cannot cut on its own. Therefore, there must be someone manipulating, using, moving the axe behind it. There must be a woodcutter. So every instrument in this world, he says the material body is a tool. It's an instrument. We can see with it, we can smell with it, we can hear with it, we can taste with it, we can touch with it. But all of those instrumental functions that the body has, it's like an axe. It can do it, but there must be a woodcutter behind it. Then he goes on and says, okay, if there's a spirit soul, then the spirit soul is the one moving the material body, is the individual within experiencing and moving the physical matter. But this spirit soul ends up experiencing things that it does not want to experience. Yes, so we experience suffering, for example. We get sick or diseased. These are things that if we had a choice, we would not experience. We would not inflict this upon ourselves. Therefore, he says, anything that is forced to experience things that are not present, that are not of his own choice, must be controlled by another being. Right? There must be something else greater than it that inflicts that upon that person. That greater being must be there. There must exist a super soul, a Paramatma, a higher being within the body that is forcing this spirit soul to experience things that he does not want to experience. Shri Shri Radha Gokulananda ki jai. Right? So in this way, he builds up the argument one after another. Right? He creates this, and each one he gives an example, a metaphor, to argue for it. When I first heard this beautiful, these wonderful examples, metaphors, and the arguments from Jiva Goswami from this verse in Srimad Bhagavatam, I thought, I wonder what Srila Prabhupada does in the purport of this verse. I was awed by the brilliance of the argument, step by step, how Jiva Goswami built it. So I looked up that verse in Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, and there, sure enough, in the purport, Prabhupada gives the whole sequence. Right? I had missed it earlier, clearly, in my reading of that purport, but there it was, the whole thing, step by step, step by step. But instead of the woodcutter and the axe, Prabhupada had replaced all the analogies with analogies of his own. instead of the woodcutter and the axe, this time we had the car and the driver. Because the point of an example in this case is to make familiar that which is unfamiliar. And a woodcutter and an axe, honestly, is unfamiliar to most people in the modern world. How many of us have seen a woodcutter work with an axe? Not anymore, right? There's bulldozers that can fell trees much faster than a woodcutter can with an axe over and over again. So Prabhupada updated the analogy to describe the spirit, soul, and the body's relationship in terms that, and instead of talking about ancient Nyaya, he talked about modern science and used the examples there and updated it to create that. So argumentation is a very important role of metaphors, right? They help us build a point and get to that point and prove a point by giving an example that helps the mind to get there. So in all of these ways, a metaphor has very, very useful features, right? It's poetically very powerful, it's very useful for teaching, and it's very powerful for argumentation. But like with anything that is very powerful and useful, a metaphor has a dangerous side to it as well. And there's two things that I want to mention about metaphor that can be very dangerous. One is that they're often, they can easily become reductive in nature. When we understand a metaphorical understanding of something, we have a tendency to reduce that thing to a mere metaphor. And the most famous example of this that Prabhupada objects to is that of the scene of the Bhagavad Gita, when Gandhiji describes the Bhagavad Gita, the setting of the Gita. The world is like a battlefield. The chariot is like the body. Krishna is like one's intellect. And we are like Arjuna, the passenger there. And he says quite explicitly in his analysis of the Gita, he says he does not regard he does not accept the idea that there is a historical Krishna or a historical Arjuna, that these things actually happened. Rather, he sees it merely as a metaphor for the human condition. Now, comparing the situation of Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra to a metaphor, to some metaphorical, giving a metaphorical understanding of that scene, that in and of itself is not wrong, right? There's nothing wrong about saying Krishna should be the one driving our chariot through this world. That's a beautiful way of thinking of Krishna's role in not just the Gita, but in our lives. In fact, in the purport to the first verse of Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada gives a metaphor of that scene. You remember what it is? He says, this battlefield of Kurukshetra is like a field in which a farmer grows, a paddy field, he says. And just as a farmer pulls out weeds from the paddy field, so in the same way, Krishna is pulling out through this battle all the unnecessary elements in society. Prabhupada gives that metaphor, but why is that acceptable? Because the metaphor does not deny the possibility of a direct meaning that upholds the historical reality of what is being described. In other words, metaphors are very seductive. They seduce us into a mere metaphorical interpretation, right? Where we take what we read only in metaphorical terms and not in literal terms. And there is no reason for that to be the case, Right? A metaphor is always compatible. The metaphorical meaning is always compatible with the literal meaning. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu makes this point clear in Adi Lila of Chaitanya Charitamrita when he's discussing with Prakashananda Saraswati. He says, always start with the direct meaning, and then, if the direct meaning doesn't apply, or if you can layer something on top of that to get deeper meaning through indirect understanding or through metaphorical understanding, then yes, you can go in that direction. But the metaphor never negates. It is always compatible with the direct meaning. The second thing, and the last thing I want to mention, the second danger of metaphors is that every metaphor has its limits. And it's very important to understand the limits of the metaphor, lest one take it too far and end up in very confusing or dangerous territories. Krishna's eyes are like the petals of a lotus, right? And they wilt just like the petals of a lotus over time. No, that doesn't work, right? It's taking that metaphor too far. It doesn't apply at that point. And fourth canto Bhagavatam says that when Dhruva Maharaj was insulted by his stepmother, he became like a snake he became angry like a snake that was hit with a stick. Right? He was hissing, he was so angry. So was Dhruva Maharaj like a snake? Did he slither like a snake? Was he poisonous like a snake? Was his character like a snake? No. Right? That's taking the metaphor too far. Now, in these cases, it's obvious that there's a limit to these metaphors. But in some cases, it can become dangerous if we don't recognize the limits of the metaphor. And a very famous example is that of the rope and the snake. This material world is deceiving in the way that, this is a famous example that the Mayavadis or the impersonalists give. A man walks out in the middle of the night on his front porch, sees a snake coiled on the floor, screams and runs back inside. He returns the next morning only to find that that wasn't a snake at all. It was just a rope. So he confused the rope for the snake. The material world is something similar, where we see something in the material world, we think, this is happiness. But it's merely a reflection. It's not the real thing. Right? It's our mental concoction. It's like Prahlad Maharaj says, our mind creates these constructions of friend and enemy when there's no friend and there's no enemy for the spirit soul. This example of rope and snake is famous as the example that Mayavadis use to make their point that the material world is a false reality. It doesn't have any reality. But the rope and snake metaphor is actually given in Srimad Bhagavatam not once but multiple times. It's a very valid and very useful metaphor that's found in the Bhagavatam and that we can use very effectively to make what point? The material world is a deceptive place. When we look at things, they don't turn out to be what they promise to be. I think I'm going to be happy by enjoying my senses, but in reality, it's a coiled up snake. It's going to simply cause me suffering. Right? That's a useful use of the metaphor, the way Bhagavatam uses it. But if you don't know the limits of the metaphor, you can keep pushing it and saying, just like the snake is a product of the imagination of the person, in the same way, this material world is the product of our imagination. It's vivarta. It's not real. And you can come to the conclusion, Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya. This material world is a false place, which is incorrect, right? So it's very important to recognize the limits of the metaphor itself. And so, just to conclude, because I know we're out of time, the metaphor has three very useful, wonderful roles, right? It serves to evoke emotion and power from the poet into the minds of the readers, to help them grasp something that is otherwise beyond their understanding. It has very useful teaching roles in order to take that which is unfamiliar and make it familiar to us. It has an argumentative role in philosophy by sealing the argument with the example, with the analogy, to show how the argument works. But it also has very dangerous functions. It can easily seduce us into being reductive in our understanding, where we reduce that which is real to mere metaphor. Nothing wrong with metaphor. Bhagavatam has limitless numbers of metaphor. But there's no reason why the metaphor needs to reduce that which is real into a mere metaphor. And secondly, we have to know the limits of the metaphor. Otherwise, we can go way too far in the metaphor and get ourselves tied into all kinds of philosophical problems. And so I'll conclude by giving an example from Chaitanya Charitamrita of how metaphor needs to be deployed, the importance of deploying it so properly. There's this story in Madhya Lila when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is in Jagannath Puri. There's this poet who comes from Bengal, and he comes to meet Bhagavan Acharya and says he's written this drama about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that he would like the devotees to hear and relish. So Bhagavan Acharya is described as being very liberal, and he says, yes, I'll listen to it. And when he listens to it, he finds it very beautiful and he praises it. And so all the other devotees listen to it and they find it very beautiful and they praise it as well. And so this poet says, we don't get the name of the poet, but the poet says that I would like Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to listen to this poetry. And so before Mahaprabhu will listen to anything, he first requires Swarup Damodar Goswami to listen to it first. He's the gate, right? He's the test. Otherwise Mahaprabhu does not want to bother with things that are messed up in terms of their philosophy or the admixture of improper rasas. So Swarup Damodar Goswami is so he says, Bhagavan Acharya on behalf of this poet begs Swarup Damodar to listen to it. And Swarup Damodar says he's not interested. But Bhagavan Acharya begs again and again and again. And finally Swarup Damodar says, okay, I'll listen. And so the poet is brought into the assembly of devotees and he recites the first verse of his poem. And in that verse, he describes how Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is like the soul of the body that is Lord Jagannath. So Jagannath is here in Jagannath Puri. He says, Prakriti Jada. He's an inert body. But he has become alive as a result of the presence of Sri Chaitanya, who is like the Atma, the soul animating the form of Lord Jagannath, who has become ecstatic as a result of Mahaprabhu's presence. And all the devotees listen to this and everyone claps and says, "Wah, wah, wah, very nice, wonderful." Everyone except Swarup Damodar. And Swarup Damodar becomes very angry and he says, "You fool, you do not understand the proper use of alankara, of ornamentation and of metaphor and of analogy. You have committed an offense not just to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, but also to Lord Jagannath. In one fell swoop, you have offended both of them through your analogy." Lord Jagannath is not a dead body. His body is always alive. Krishna never has a material form. He never has a form made of Prakriti. He is living. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, you have compared him to an individual spiritual spark, the Atma, when in fact he is Swayam Bhagavan himself. He is the source of all the Atmas. He is the Supreme Lord. In this way, you have offended two people with just one metaphor, right? And so he becomes very upset, and the devotees all recognize their mistake. And Swarup Damodar tells this poet that you're going to suffer in hell for many births for the result of your offense. But to the poet's credit, he immediately falls at the feet of Swarup Damodar and begs for forgiveness and admits his ignorance and says, I am indeed a fool for trying to describe the Supreme Lord without properly understanding the science of bhakti, bhakti siddhanta. He says, I've been a fool. Please show me how to receive the mercy of Mahaprabhu. And because of his humility and his devotion, the devotees give him refuge. Swarup Damodar gives him so much compassion and mercy and says, it's okay, don't worry. If you want to understand Bhakti Siddhanta, the truths about bhakti, please learn Srimad Bhagavatam from a devotee who understands the philosophy of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Then you can write nicely and properly about the Lord. Do not try before then. And indeed, this poet takes that instruction to heart, learns Srimad Bhagavatam nicely amongst the associates of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, so much so that because of his humility and his knowledge, the devotees introduce him to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he gets a direct darshan, direct audience of Mahaprabhu himself, which was, of course, his ultimate goal. So for all of us who are confused by metaphors, who may misuse metaphors, who may not fully understand them, even as I don't fully understand this metaphor about Srimati Radharani's beauty and her love for Krishna, there is still hope to receive the mercy of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, just like that Brahmin. Thank you all so much for your attention today. Hare Krishna. So I think, we still have time. Somehow I didn't see the clock properly, right? We've got 10 minutes to go still. Oh. Okay. Okay. So shall we help the cook, at least for another 10, 15 minutes? So yes, this is good. I'm glad I was mistaken about the time. This leaves us some opportunity for questions and discussion. Yes, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. I was hearing the first part of the class at home, but then I came in. At the end, you gave the pastime of the poet to present, his realization, wrong realization to Swarup Damodar. Just something came to mind because the offense was that Mahaprabhu and Lord Jagannath, they are the same. It's not that Mahaprabhu is the soul of Jagannath. But I remember some time back I even put this question on Facebook, but I couldn't get any. I've always felt uncomfortable with the word incarnation. Prabhupada, he uses it a lot in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Because I've studied Latin, incarnation, carne, means flesh. Now, when people they ask me, who is this Nishingadev or Lord Ram, I always feel, uncomfortable to say he's the incarnation of Krishna, of Vishnu. Because it's like I am inviting people to these metaphors, understanding that the Lord enters into a body of flesh. I don't know if you are following what I'm...
Yes, very much.
Now, why the Acharya? I'm not trying, to put you on the spot, but you are a scholar. Why they use this term, incarnation, and not something else? Because I feel it's not appropriate.
Yes.
It's just my opinion. It's not that I want to contradict, Srila Prabhupada's.
Yes. Yes. So this is a wonderful question and point. I've thought about this many times myself. Let me answer your question by starting a little bit broadly, which is to say that language itself is analogical. It consists of analogy. whether it's an explicit one or not. And what I mean by this is when we use words in a particular language, then we pull into our discussion concepts that are embedded in that language and use it to describe something in another language or situation. So translation is basically an active analogy, right? So, for example, the word God, right? When we use the word God, then anyone who hears the word God in the English language, depending on their background, will hear certain things that are connected with it. If they're from a Christian background, they're going to immediately think, oh, Krishna is God. So they're going to think certain things about what God is like. If they're from a Muslim background, they hear Krishna as God. Immediately they'll import certain concepts with that idea, with that word. And this is why, one of the reasons why Srila Prabhupada didn't just use the word God. He did occasionally, but he specified, he elaborated much more carefully, Supreme Personality of Godhead, right? Where he built a concept around the word Bhagavan, which is often just translated as God in English. Because with devotional service. The word devotion is too passive. It refers in English to a state of existence, of state of mind. But Prabhupada emphasized that bhakti is active. It involves not just a feeling, not just a state, but actual service of investing ourselves in the service of the Lord. Supreme Personality of Godhead, devotional service, a lot of terms that Srila Prabhupada used, created in English in order to better express deep theological ideas that are embedded in the Sanskrit words that he was translating, like Bhagavan and like Bhakti. So now to your point about incarnation or avatar. The word incarnation is used in Christian theology, this is where its origins are, to describe Jesus. And the classical understanding of Jesus is that he is God who becomes human, as in he takes a human body with physical flesh that has the capacity to feel pain, to be diseased, and ultimately to die. And for Christians, this is a pillar of their faith, that Jesus actually died on the cross. Not just pretended to die, but actually died on the cross. And the reason this is possible is because he had a material, physical body. That's the karna, the incarnation, the flesh. So God becoming human, God taking on flesh. So this word, for someone who understands Christian theology, is problematic in explaining the Vaishnava understanding of avatar. It works much better with the Mayavadi understanding of avatar, which is that God takes on a human body that is material, like this poet was saying, that this is a classical Mayavadi understanding of what the avatar is. But at the same time, so historically speaking, yes, the word is problematic. But in the English language, there are very few options available to us to express the concept of avatar, right? So Prabhupada, another word that he used very frequently is appearance. The appearance of the Lord, this is his appearance day. And this word appearance avoids the problems of the word incarnation. But it has its own problems, right? Because the word appearance in English also has this sense of a mere appearance. That the Lord is like a phantom. He appears like something not tangible. When we understand that Krishna was very much tangible. Not just the devotees, but even the demons could see him and feel him and hear him, right? So he was very much like in physical form. He was tangible, even though not material, right? So the word appearance has some trouble there. The word avatar literally means one who descends. So one could describe him as the Lord's descent to this world. But then using that term to describe the 10 main descents of Krishna describes an action and not an entity, a personality, right? So Lord Nrsimhadev as a descent makes it sound like He's just an instance of the Lord's appearance, when in fact Nrsimhadev is a different personality than Lord Ramachandra. So the problem being that there's no good English equivalent that exactly maps onto the word avatar, particularly as the word avatar is used by Vaishnavas, not by other philosophical schools, but by Vaishnava schools. And so one does the best one can with incarnation, with appearance, with descent, with manifestation. Prabhupada even, actually Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur even created a term here, just like he did with devotional service, called plenary manifestation. You've heard that? Again and again. He's a plenary incarnation, plenary manifestation. This was Srila Prabhupada and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's attempt to get around the problems of incarnation. Incarnation means in flesh, that is mere human body. But by saying plenary, what does the word plenary mean? He's a plenary incarnation. The word plenum in Latin means whole, right? He's whole, he's entire, he's complete. In other words, when he says he's a plenary incarnation, means that there is nothing left behind from the original to the incarnate, right? There's no difference between the two. He is a plenum, he is the whole. There's full, right? Fullness. Purnam is plenum, right? So Purnavatar, he's a plenary incarnation. So Prabhupada actually creates terms. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Bhaktivinoda Thakur create words, create phrases in English to get around the problem of analogy in translation. Because again, every translation is analogical. You're comparing X with Y. I remember I live in Utah in the United States, which is the home state for the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon branch of Christianity, the Mormons. And they have their scripture called the Book of Mormon. And one time I've received a copy of the Book of Mormon in Hindi. And the title of the Book of Mormon in Hindi is Mormon Dharmashastra. Now, why is that funny? Because anyone who receives that book in India is going to go, Dharmashastra? And what are they going to think? Bhagavad Gita, Dharma, doing your duty, the 4 different varnas, none of which is found in Mormon Dharmashastra. None of it, right? But they're drawing an analogy to try to explain to the new reader what this book is. It's a scripture. It's a Dharmashastra. So when we do this in English, we do it in the opposite direction. But it's always a difficult thing. It's always a challenging thing. And this is why Prabhupada is actually very, very keen, very careful in the words that he uses. Right? There's that famous point he made about cattle raising versus cow protection. He used that phrase intentionally. Right? No one before him spoke in English about cow protection. It was a phrase that he created. Devotional service, a phrase that he created. Supreme Personality of Godhead, phrase that he or his predecessors created. Right? So you create these terms in order to help the reader understand what's being said. Is that okay? Thank you. Yes, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
It's on, yes.
Thank you for the class. I think my question was regarding, we have this term called Sakhi Skande on the verse. So if you can elaborate a bit more, because we are using Madhya Vyasa. So you said something regarding Sakhi Skande is that he's always in her youth. So we have Madhya Vyasa and Sakhi Skande, both terms kind of on a similar meaning. So if you can just elaborate a bit more.
Yeah. So the Madhya Vyasa is the middle youth, right? Middle youth. So not the very young age. That has already been compared. Srimati Radharani's very young age has already been compared to something, and I forget what it was compared to earlier. And not the older youth, where one is basically an adult or almost middle age, but this Madhya Vyasa is the most beautiful age. This is the age that Krishna is eternally, Srimati Radharani is eternally, where you're old enough, where the emotions of youth are fully developed between a young man and a young woman, between all the different social relationships that children are unaware of in all their qualities, but especially this madhurya or ujjvala rasa, the conjugal mellow, is present at this age, but it hasn't yet matured into the type of grossness and the heaviness that is found in that relationship when one becomes older, right? So when we think of the age of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, about that age, right? This is, in the United States, we would call it junior high or high school, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th standard, where the emotions are just emerging and they're very simultaneously intense and innocent at the same time. Right? They're intense and they're innocent. The grossness of sexual desire that is present in one's adulthood that comes after marriage, where those intimate relations can often become sources of using another human being for one's own pleasure and manipulation and power in relationships. That's not present, right? There's an innocence around it where the mind often doesn't even go to the depths of that sort of lust, but merely a glance from someone one has a crush on, right? In English we say having a crush on someone. It's intense. You can't do anything but think of that person, a total fascination. And every little thing, they looked at me, right? And it's like, oh. And then you go off and talk to your friends about the fact that he looked at me, or she looked at me, or did you see what they were wearing today? Or they gave me a gift today. I got this, right? And it's something tiny and not of much value materially, but it's like causes the heart to flutter and to skip and to stop for just a moment. That age of middle youth is a very special age because it's both intense and innocent at the same time, right? At this point in marriage, if my wife looks at me, well, okay, she looked at me, right? It's like, what's the big deal? And even if it's a look with love, it's to be expected, right? It doesn't cause the same feelings that it once did, right? At a certain age, a sidelong glance causes feelings that you lose after a certain age. Right? It doesn't have that same effect anymore. It's in the freshness of youth. Navayovana, it's called. Navayovanamcha. Right? That those emotions a young man or young woman is just trying to explore, just starting to explore. Right? And so that's the age at which Radha and Krishna do all their leelas, and the gopis do their leela. And the manjaris are younger still, where they're even younger. So they have some appreciation for how this works, but not quite fully manifest in them yet. Whereas in Radha and Krishna, it's manifest, but still quite innocent. And that is the perfect age for Madhurya Rasa. Right? That's the perfect age for these feelings, that Madhya Vayasa. And so that Madhya Vayasa, that middle youth age, is being compared to Sakhi Skandhe. It's compared to the gopi, the Sakhi, the friend, upon whose shoulders Srimati Radharani has her hand. She, that Sakhi, represents that age of middle youth that Srimati Radharani is eternally embodying. Okay, how are we doing as far as the cooks? Yes. Okay. Okay. Yes. Any questions here? No? Okay. So who had their hand up here? Several people. Okay. I'll try to answer more quickly now. So we'll start from the left and work our way to the right.
One is where Prabhupada
Yes, I think
it's
it's
the expression unknowingly sometimes he says something. The trouble with our senses, they're nonsense. Just something, so it just plucks out the air, but instantly we know what he means. It's just wonderful. You know, whether he knows he said it or, consciously said it. This is like a spontaneity. Or taking shelter of the results of your activities. Don't take shelter. These things that he expresses in English so well. That's all I can think of really. It's sort of, they're like spontaneous turns of phrases. They just, you're struck by them, whether he knowingly uses them, consciously in that way.
Shish, thank you. Srila Prabhupada is a master of language, of the use of language. Very, very expert. On the one hand, he's very expert in his use of language, and at getting to the point. And on the other hand, he makes his point crystal clear over and over and over again. So that one of the beauties of Prabhupada's books is if you misunderstand a point in one place, it'll be corrected in the next verse, right? Or in the verse after, or in the next book. He makes the points that he wants to convey, he makes them crystal clear over and over and over again. So that he's made his books misinterpretation proof. Right? Like it's very difficult to misinterpret Prabhupada's intention if you actually read his books. If you take one verse and pull it out of context and twist it around and make that the foundation of your new philosophy, okay, that's one thing. But if you read his books as a whole, Prabhupada over and over and over again, the points that he wants us to get, he will make them clear repeatedly. And he'll do so with great expertise in his use of language. So it's thank you for that point. Very nice. Yes, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Yes.
I just think in that, can we say in terms of the word incarnation, that there is no issue when we consider that flesh doesn't necessarily mean material.
Yes, thank you. So that's another way to look at it, right? That one can understand flesh not just in mere material terms, but also as substance that is spiritual. So we can reinterpret that word. Although the prefix with it makes it a little bit more challenging, because it refers specifically to taking on the flesh, right? So it signifies some difference between spirit and matter there. But anyway, point well taken.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify something before we round up the class. For the benefit of those online and the devotees here. By the way, the answer was good.
Thank you.
It's just that I didn't want to give the impression that I'm defying the borrowing of words, because I feel that Prabhupada is borrowing those words. They're not given words. I'm not defying them, but you are correct. It's because of my background. I was actually almost Catholic priest. For 12 years I was brought up, in this psychology, in this education. And that's why the word incarnation, it's all about flesh. That's all it is. But anyway, let's leave things as they are. I just wanted to make clear that I'm not defying
Sure.
what Prabhupada states in his books.
Yes. I didn't take it as...
But I didn't want to deny, be untruthful. I've always felt uncomfortable. And also, I felt hypocrisy. We say that Krishna is all spiritual, but why we put him in a box of flesh, with the words that we use. It's difficult for me when I have friends, Christian friends, priests, it's difficult to preach to them about this. Anyway,
Yes.
Hariko.
Since you were almost a Catholic priest and you understand Catholic theology, when I'm explaining Krishna consciousness to people who are Catholics in background, then I often to explain the idea of avatar and also of deity worship, I prefer, rather than the word incarnation, to use the idea of transubstantiation. I think that does a better job, which is, again, it's too much detail to explain right now that term, but basically when something material becomes spiritual, right? That's not exactly for avatar, but especially for the deity. The concept of transubstantiation gets, for Catholics, it's like, yep, got it. And it's not a concept that Protestants appreciate, so it's specifically helpful for Catholics. So, yes. Final question here. Yes, Prabhu.
You spoke of avatar and you said there's no appropriate translation in English. About the word avatar, because I know you've been studying some Sanskrit. Do you know how to break down this word? Because you said there's no proper translation in English.
Yes. Yes, we can explain the etymology of avatar. It's quite straightforward. Ava means down, and tara comes from the root tr, which means to cross. So one who crosses down is an avatar. But the important thing to recognize is that the etymological meaning of a word does not necessarily convey the theological meaning of the word, right? So yes, the concept of avatar means to cross down. That's something that a Mayavadi would agree with and a Vaishnava would agree with, that meaning of the word. And yet both have very different theological understandings of the word. So the Sanskrit root is useful, but only as a starting point. The accepted or the theological meaning is sometimes different. And this is true in general. The word pankaja means lotus, but the etymological meaning, the root is panka means mud, and ja means born from mud, right? So that could be a lotus, that could be a worm, that could be anything, born from mud. But in context, pankaja always means lotus. It means nothing else in Sanskrit, right? The actual purport of the word. So avatar is like that, means to cross down, one who crosses down. But that doesn't convey the full power of that concept. Okay, I think it is 9 o'clock or almost such. Thank you all so much for your attention and for this opportunity. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Granth Raj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.